Hello everybody, my name is Oksana Mont and I come from the International Institute for Industrial Environmental Economics at Lund University, Sweden. Today I'm excited to share with you insights and preliminary findings from my project that is called Urban Sharing, Sustainability and Institutionalization. It's another ERC funded project on sharing economy. My project aims to understand how urban sharing business models are designed, how they deliver and capture value. We're also aiming to evaluate multidimensional sustainability impacts and claims of urban sharing organizations. And we're interested to explain institutionalization processes of sharing in diverse urban contexts. This is an international project and we are focusing on 5 cities across the globe, including Amsterdam, Toronto, Shanghai, Seoul and Melbourne. I have a team of 8 researchers in total, ranging from professors to postdoctoral researchers and PhD students. We are looking at 3 sharing sectors, including space, mobility and physical goods. The unit analysis in the project is dual. First, of course, we're looking at the urban sharing organizations per se, but then we also look at cities and specifically city councils that have critical role to play in shaping the landscape of urban sharing across cities. It's a complex project, 5-year long and international, so we are combining qualitative and quantitative methods. In qualitative methods, we conduct interviews with stakeholders in the cities. We do mobile research labs where the team of researchers visits different cities, engages with stakeholders in them. We organize workshops, we discuss our findings with stakeholders and get feedback. And then we also engage with sustainability impact assessment. So there we rely more on qualitative studies, scenario design, but also very much using life cycle assessments, input-output models and hybrid versions of these 2 approaches. In this presentation, I'm drawing on preliminary findings from the ERC project with Amsterdam, Toronto and Shanghai as case cities, but I'm also relying on our findings from a previous project on the sharing economy where we looked at Berlin, London and San Francisco, looking at both the USOs and the role of city councils. And I'm also using insights from the ongoing Swedish focus project where we look at the city governance of sharing economy. And it's my colleague Julia Wojtenko-Palgan who leads that project, and from there I'm using examples of Malmö and Gothenburg, the 2 Swedish cities. In our project we rely on communicating our results to different audiences. So we design and write city snapshots, which is a 2-page summary of our impressions from understanding and learning about sharing economy in different cities. Then we follow up the snapshots with city reports, which are usually more comprehensive understanding and a book of sharing economy in the city, and it aims to provide also recommendations to city councils on how they can engage with the sharing economy. We also develop videos. My colleague Julia Wojtenko-Palgan has recorded 6 films where she discusses different governance mechanisms for municipalities to engage in the sharing economy. Of course, we also have a website with a vibrant blog where we also present our findings, activities and publications. My colleague Stephen Kane Curtis also recorded a podcast where he looked at the role of scooters in the sharing economy and discussing their sustainability. We also engaged in developing educational material. One of the channels is massive online educational courses, and one of them looks at sharing cities with the focus on governance and urban sustainability. Finally, we of course publish academic and practitioner articles and papers and reports. Next, I will look at the three focus areas: business model, sustainability, institutionalization, and governance. When we study business models of sharing economy, we are looking at them from sustainability perspective. So in the follow-up slides, I will talk about sharing economy business models and how they contribute to sustainability. Of course, as every researcher, we start from mapping the field, identifying the state-of-the-art knowledge, and my colleagues Stephen Ken Curtis and Matthias Lerner conducted a systematic literature review for defining the sharing economy for sustainability. In this work, they also identified 5 features they call building blocks of a sustainable sharing economy. Unlike the traditional sharing we've all experienced within our families, the new type of sharing is ICT mediated. The author also claimed that the sharing economy, in order to be sustainable, it has to have non-pecuniary motivation for ownership and for sharing, idling capacity of existing stock of goods, unlike the traditional economy where newly produced goods are sold. Then they discussed the such feature as temporary access, where ownership is not transferred to the next user. And they discussed the rivalrous nature of the products that are shared, meaning that the products cannot be shared simultaneously by different users. Taking into account the nature of our project that would like to evaluate sustainability impacts of sharing business models, we are focusing on tangible goods. And as I mentioned, we look at the 3 sectors: space, mobility, and physical goods. The first area is to try to understand how urban sharing business models are shaped, what their features are, and what their characteristics are. So the first, which came to our understanding, is that sharing economy are triangular business models, meaning that they have 3 actors involved in the actual core of the model. This is sharing platform that has a mediating role between resource owner who has the assets, unlike in traditional business models where the provider actually is the owner, the resource owner. And we also have resource users who gain access to the asset instead of buying product and owning it. When we then try to describe the models, we rely on the business model canvas by Osterwalder. We advance it and developed a morphological framework where we talk about 3 value dimensions, 16 attributes, and 67 choices. We use this morphological framework in order to map urban sharing landscape in different cities, and in the future we will use it for comparing the cities. The next step in our work is to discuss and look into how value is co-created in urban sharing business models, and there we will look at sharing as a practice and what does it mean if we think about sharing as a practice from the platform perspective or from the perspective of resource user and resource owner. So far, we see that the practice of sharing has implications for what type of sustainability impacts, especially environmental ones, we will see from the business models. When we talk about sustainability evaluations, then we think in terms of social sustainability, environmental and economic sustainability. So in social evaluation, again, we started with the literature review. The systematic literature review provided us with a list of positive and negative impacts that are associated with urban sharing platforms. But there is a lack of a systematic framework to measure the social impacts of sustainability. This led us to identify 4 distinct and least overlapping in literature aspects of social sustainability, which are empowerment, trust, inclusivity, and social justice. We then brought these 4 aspects to a stakeholder workshop where we met with people representing different city councils that engage with sharing economy, and we engaged them as well in their role as users of sharing economy. During the workshop, we discussed how to define social indicators and how to measure them. Based on this work, we developed a tool for assessing social impacts of sharing platforms, where we have the 4 aforementioned aspects and 18 indicators. Currently, we are operationalizing the tool, developing questions that could guide and give us, help us collect data, and then we focus these questions on platforms. We would like to pose these questions to resource owners and resource users and see whether the social impacts are different depending on from which perspective we are assessing them. Then I move on to describing our work on environmental and economic evaluation. What we see here is the gaps in literature that talk about very few quantitative assessments of environmental economic impacts of sharing. The gaps are only because there is a predominant focus on direct environmental impacts, and secondary and wider effects are unexplored. When we would like to evaluate direct and indirect impacts, we use case studies, working with real-life companies, obtaining data from them and trying to understand behavioral aspects, how the users, resource owners and resource users are behaving, what are their business model features, and how city infrastructural context affect how business models are performing. We use, as I said previously, life cycle assessments for understanding direct impacts and hybrid input-output LCs for indirect and macro effects. Initial observations from this work, for example, if we look at the shared mobility cases, we see that car-driven distances shrink among prior car owners who shed their cars and moved to car sharing. We see high use of public transportation and bikes. We see minor additional driving among non-owners of cars who now join car sharing, but it's not that big. We also see that prior car owners shed cars and save money, and on the contrary, car sharers who share their cars, they can generate additional income from sharing own cars. Jobs are generated, and we see some respending effects that might be negative. If we look at the specific example of peer-to-peer car sharing in Amsterdam, what we see there is that indeed non-car owners and car sharers drive 25 to 30% less of shared cars than car owners. So there is a difference between whether you owned car before or not prior to joining car sharing, and that these non-car owners and car sharers, they use public transport and bikes more than car owners. In this case, we also try to understand the impact at the city level, and we compare the baseline scenario, the current mix of mobility options, with option where we see increased used cars of shared vehicles, and in scenario 2 where we project increased use of shared cars in public transport. We show that scenario 2 has twice as little CO2 emissions than the baseline, so this is encouraging news. Then we have an example from Germany where we look at direct and indirect impacts, and then we ask a question: how does sharing influence disposal income of car sharing users? How consumption patterns change among sharing users, and what is the carbon balance of sharers versus non-sharers? There we see that environmental impacts reduction is usually due to shorter distances traveled and fewer cars on the roads. We see that impacts of respending could be high in carbon-intensive impact categories. For example, if you save money on shifting to sharing cars and start international flying. And then that for most users, the rebound effects from induced indirect consumption do not offset the carbon savings of car sharing. So this is also encouraging. Finally, we are currently developing the hybrid life cycle assessment model based on input and output analysis. And we will continue our work with the unit of analysis being city level, and hoping that this will help us also use the model for understanding global impacts. We will keep utilizing bottom-up approach in order to build our data sets for macroeconomic modeling. When it comes to governance work, we look at the role of municipal governance at the governments in the sharing economy. And our starting point is understanding that institutionalization dynamics of urban sharing depends on the institutional work of urban sharing organizations, USOs, and the governance mechanisms employed by municipalities in governing urban sharing. With this work, we also developed municipal governance framework, where we identify 5 mechanisms: enabling, regulating, providing, self-governing, and collaborating, and 11 roles of municipal governance of the sharing economy. This framework can be used in order to understand the spectrum of municipal governance mechanisms that we can use in cross-city comparison. For example, in Amsterdam, that's an example of city that has entire range of type of engagement with the sharing economy, from prohibiting to regulating, from being neutral, encouraging and supporting. London and Berlin are similar in that we haven't identified any directly supporting mechanisms, but we see all other mechanisms and spectrum being present. Gothenburg and Malmö, 2 Swedish cities, they are similar in that they do not have prohibiting or regulating engagements, because these are taken care of at the national level, but very much encouraging and supporting mechanisms, and especially for community-based and non-profit urban sharing organizations. San Francisco and Toronto, again similar cities where we didn't find much of prohibiting anything, but neither encouraging or supporting. They either have neutral stance, or they regulate, for example, short-term home rentals in both cities, and in Toronto also regulates car sharing and ride-hailing. We ask ourselves the question why we see such difference between cities in engaging with urban sharing, and we're finding answers in looking at the contextual factors, such as, for example, structural factors like regulation and infrastructure, political economic factors, looking at the type of economies and their governing principles, looking at political factors, for example, types of electoral logic and voting systems. Also, sustainability factors play an increasingly important role, but very different. In some cities, they're seeing as sustainability challenges, while in other cities, city councils see them as sustainability aspirations. We also indirectly use cultural factors by engaging and looking at cultural dimensions from the cultural theory and model by Hofstede. This project is ending its 2nd year, so we still have 3 years to come, and we are looking forward for much more interesting insights when we engage more in cross-city comparisons of all 3 levels: business models, sustainability impacts, and institutionalization. I'm encouraging everybody to have a look at our website and engage with us as researchers. Thank you very much for listening.